My name is Małgorzata Bakalaś-Diverge, and I am Director of Academic Programs at the Center for Jewish History. And I'm thrilled to welcome you today to our virtual space, to an opening panel of our new series called Family Affairs. The Center for Jewish History is a home for the archival collections of 5 partner institutions: American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and Yeshiva University Museum. Together, these collections create the second largest archive of the Jewish experience in the world. Above all, though, the collections housed at the center carry the potential for an invaluable richness of stories and histories, and her stories, which have been studied and brought to light by professional scholars and history lovers alike. Tonight, we will explore some stories at the crossroads of the professional and the personal, and we'll look at how family history writing informs and shifts disciplinary historical reflection. The Family Affairs throughout this academic year will be featuring scholars who at different moments of their careers decided to turn to their personal history and the findings and questions that this is inspired. The series is curated by Dr. Natalia Alexiun, who will share some more about it in her introduction, and who will be moderating our conversation tonight, and also all the conversations during the academic year. Before I pass her the virtual mic, let me introduce our panelists. There is a serious problem here because we have with us today some extremely accomplished scholars, so please forgive the short bios that do not give enough justice to their achievements, but will let us start our conversation without delay. Dr. Natalia Alexiun is professor of modern Jewish history at Touro University. Her research interests developed around the Holocaust, Polish and Jewish history and historiography, gender studies, and beyond. She published extensively in numerous journals, among them in Yad Vashem Studies, East European Jewish Affairs, Studies in Contemporary Jewry, Polin, East European Societies and Politics, and German History. Her book, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, was just released, and we will actually celebrate it at the center next Tuesday, stay tuned, in conversation with Sam Kassow. She's currently working on a book about the so-called cadaver affair at European universities in the 1920s and 30s. Omer Bartov is John Birkelund Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown University. His early research concerned the Nazi indoctrination of the Wehrmacht and the crimes it committed in World War II. His more recent work has focused on inter-ethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. His book, Erased, investigates the politics of memory in West Ukraine, while his most recent monograph, called Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz, is a microhistory of ethnic coexistence and violence. He has just completed a new monograph, tentatively titled Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Past. Atina Grossmann is professor of history in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Cooper Union in New York City. Her broad research interests center around gender and women's studies, German Jewish and refugee studies, and the Holocaust. Numerous publications include Jews, Germans and the Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany, and Reforming Sex, the German Movement for Birth Control and Abortion Reform, 1920-1950. Tonight, she will reflect on her book in progress, a project that follows her German Jewish refugee parents on their journey from Europe to the Middle East and Asia. It is called Trauma, Privilege, and Adventure in Transit, Jewish Refugees in Iran and India. Daniel Mendelsohn is an internationally best-selling author, critic, essayist, and translator. Since 1991, he has been a contributor of essays, reviews, and articles to many publications, most frequently The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. In February 2019, he was named editor-at-large of the New York Review of Books and the director of the Robert Silvers Foundation, a charitable fund that supports writers of nonfiction, essay, and criticism. Mendelsohn's books, widely acclaimed and awarded, include An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, and The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 million. His 10th book, Three Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative and Fate, was just released last week. Congratulations. He teaches literature at Bard College. Finally, 2 reminders. You are welcome to write down your questions for the Q&A portion of your program. To do so, please use the Q&A function visible on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions throughout the program. Also, our program is recorded and will be available via the Center's YouTube channel very soon, and we will email you the link with the recording as well. And now, without further ado, Natalia Alexiou, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Małgo, and thank you, Center for Jewish History. I must say that when we started plotting the series, we were sitting in a cafe on the Upper West Side, drinking coffee with very close proximity of a lot of fellow New Yorkers, and not really envisioning that we will be Zooming it and not sitting together in the auditorium at the Center for Jewish History. On the other hand, though, this is how we were able to have Daniel Mendelsohn today with us and not on book tour in France. So I want to say that we have one more problem other than the incredibly impressive bios, which is having 3 incredibly interesting authors and scholars and only some 60 plus minutes for a conversation. So I will keep my opening remarks to the bare minimum. And I just want to say, to get us started, that obviously there has always been a connection between historians and their histories, and that this connection tended to be veiled and never explicit. In fact, I think this was part of the professional outlook of the studies. And I was envisioning the series about Meyer Bauerban, my fellow Galicianer, and the first Jewish historian to hold a chair in Jewish history before the Holocaust in Poland, and how he would ask his students at Warsaw University, all of whom were young Jews, about their hometowns. And this is how he would start incorporating in his lectures their family stories and their towns. But I think this was a hook, and in the end they were not writing personal histories or family histories when they were writing their MA thesis and dissertations. Rather, this was an introduction into the craft and the task at hand. And so, of course, after the Holocaust, people continue to write about their towns. This is the key to the wealth of memorial books, Iskarbücher, which are not just chronicles of destroyed Jewish communities, but also of families. And professional historians sometimes edit those or write introductions with footnotes. But I think that today we see more and more a scholarship that is openly blending the familial link and the examination of sources, where family history becomes the framework, and it is the family history of the author. And in fact, both Daniel Mendelsohn and Omer Bartov's books start with memories of childhood. That's Omer's first chapter. So today I want to talk about their experiences in bringing together this framework, using this framework, and what it means for the possibilities of recovering the past as recovering family history. So let me start with Daniel Mendelsohn's statement in one of the interviews I had the pleasure of listening to. And they were lucky people in Amsterdam, they had an hour with you. But you said in this interview that your book is, The Lost is not about the Holocaust, but about the family. And so I would like to ask you, and also Omer and Atina, in what way, what is the relationship, in what way your books are framing those two aspects of writing about the Holocaust and writing about the family, and what it means for your projects?
Well, I would start by saying that I think it's very important to underscore from the outset that unlike my distinguished co-panelists, I am not, in fact, a scholar of the Holocaust. I'm not a scholar of Jewish history. I'm not a scholar of Judaic studies. In as much as I am a scholar, it is in a completely different field, which is classical Greek and Latin, the bad guys in Jewish history. So for me, I think it's important to say that because both Atina and Omer have a sort of a different kind of problem or challenge, let's call it, because they're bona fide scholars. And for me, it was never a question of, how do I frame my writing as a family tale, even though it's also about the Holocaust, because I'm a memoirist. All I do is write about my family. So I'm sort of coming at it from the other end of this telescope to some extent, if that makes any sense. And I've, of course, read Omer's book, and we both sort of interestingly start in the same place. But for me, the Holocaust really was about family, first and foremost. It was not history and then family, or how to fit history into family or family into history. I was a kid growing up with people sort of alluding in this dark, opaque way to these relatives who had been killed. And so for me, it was always a family affair, actually. And I backed into the Holocaust. And I think I went to great efforts in my book to make it clear that I'm not a scholar, and I'm just writing a book about what one guy can figure out about 6 relatives who perished, whom he never knew, whom he never had a connection to, and yet sort of lingered at the periphery of his family experience. So I think it's important to emphasize that, because I think it's interesting because both Omer and Atina are sort of attacking the issue, I would think, with a certain, I would say, more responsibilities in a funny way to a kind of serious intellectual and scholarly framework.
Omer?
Yeah, so in some ways that's exactly the two polar approaches, because when I was researching for a very long time this book on Buczacz, the book was about the Holocaust, or not only about the Holocaust, but about the long roots of this eruption of violence in one town. And family, in a sense, you could say, was incidental to it. But it didn't end up being that. So something happened in the process. And what happened in the process, I would say, was that, as I write in the book, my interview with my mother 25 years ago created this sort of intimacy with a particular place. And that intimacy played into the way I began thinking about a historical project. Now, it was still not about my family, because there's very little known about my family there. And my mother and her parents and 2 brothers came to Palestine before the Holocaust, before World War II. But that intimacy that it gave me, this sense that this was a place that my mother actually grew up in and that she had memories from, injected something different to the entire historical project. And I think that what it did, among with other influences, it brought in the voice of individuals, the sense that what occurred there is part of a large history, but it's also very much a small history. And it's a history of people who were there, who spoke about it, who remembered it, or who were killed there. And as I was working on that, I imagined the project as a kind of cacophony of voices, of people speaking from there. In fact, the original name of the book, before my publisher and I decided to change it, was The Voice of Your Brother's Blood. So it was very much about that, about the voice of individuals. And so that personal intimacy with the fact that my mother spoke about it to me when she was already 71 for the first time ever. And she spoke to me about it as nobody else had heard it, because she was speaking to her son and she had never spoken about that before like that with me, was then grafted onto this entire panoply of voices from there. So it became, in that sense, an intimate history of genocide and of what occurred before. So I think that there is a kind of overlap with Daniel's project, although we're coming from exactly opposite poles.
Atina?
Yeah, I was just thinking that we have this extra level of unexpected intimacy here with Zoom as I'm listening to Omer speak from his study, and you know, this view into the spaces in which we're trying to think about all of these questions. I suppose that in my case, it is in a sense the other end of what Daniel expressed, that I backed into the family story from the practice of writing history, and I think, as with almost all of the work that I've done over the years, I ended up in a completely unexpected place, both in terms of theme and in terms of geography, because I never intended to write a family history. And ironically, I think I ended up with the topic of refugee Jews and their sort of very ambivalent and paradoxical experiences in what they always seem to call the Orient, by engaging in this rather foolhardy adventure of writing about a topic that I emphatically was not connected to and had nothing to do, I thought, with my own family history, which I thought of as being a German Jewish history, namely the experience of mostly Polish Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, first after the war in occupied Germany, and then through that research, realizing that there was another story to be told that is now been told more frequently, but at the time that I sort of found it for myself was still quite marginalized, namely that most of the Jewish survivors, the DPs that I had written about and was writing about in my book, had survived because they had escaped or ended up in the far reaches of the Soviet Union. And it was only then, again, so that was already one unexpected step in my trajectory, away from anything to do with my story directly. And then it was really through the archival research, mostly, actually, I have to say, in the archives of the Joint, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in New York, at the time still in a warehouse in Queens and in Jerusalem, that I realized that there was another dimension to this story, namely the dimension of Iran and India. And it was really sitting in the old JDC office in Jerusalem, going through what was still then the original, the original files, that I started to understand that Tehran, which for me had been very present in my childhood as a place that had been the site of where my parents, both from Berlin, had met, was actually the headquarters of a relief operation for Polish Jews who were seeking to survive in the Soviet Union, and of course also, as we know, the transit point. for the Tehran Jews and for Jewish members of the Polish exile army. And it was in those files that I found the name of the man, Yoshua Polak, who I actually still remembered. I spent many hours in his sukkah on West End Avenue before they went back to Israel, who I knew as having been my mother's boss in Tehran. In the files, he is listed as a Palestinian merchant in Iran. And it was that moment of finding something in the archives where I was looking for material that had absolutely nothing to do with my family, that I started to think that this story that I knew from the Quran on our dining room table, from the fact that until I was 14, I thought inshallah was a German word, because that transit was so integrated into my life growing up, that there was actually a history, and a history of the war and of the Holocaust that could be connected to what I thought was the rather idiosyncratic trajectory of my parents. So in that sense, my parents' materials, which that'll be in the next question perhaps, are unlike what the traces that Omer and Daniel were looking for. Very voluminous material became the way in which I was able to access a whole history that is much broader than that of my own family.
Omer, please.
Just one thing that listening to Daniel and Atina made me think about. First is that there's so many contradictions in these stories. So I spent the first 35 years of my life in Israel. I was surrounded by survivors of the Holocaust, people from Poland, people spoke Polish around in the neighborhood. And I was determined never to touch that thing. I believe that as a budding historian, I could not touch the Holocaust. It was too intimate, it was too close. I would have no distance from it, no objectivity. And I was growing up in a country that had very strong opinions about it. And I didn't think that I could say anything beyond these sort of very rigid opinions about its meaning. And it took me leaving the place and coming to this country in my mid-30s to begin to understand that all that time I was actually learning about that event and had created, in a sense, even the geographical distance to be able to think about it. So what I'm saying is that it starts actually as a very intimate thing. I then have to build a distance from it and then return to it as an intimate story. So that's the first point that just occurred to me as the kind of circles that we go through. And the second, what Atina was saying, it just reminded me of a moment when I was sitting in an archive in Lviv, in Lvov, Lemberg, the capital of West Ukraine now, of East Galicia once. And I was sitting with two Ukrainian research assistants, and we were all going through documents, and I was looking through documents in Hebrew, and a piece of paper fell into my lap, literally. This paper that breaks down, this yellow paper. And I picked it up, and on it there were 3 names, and one of the names was the name of my maternal grandfather, and the note said that he had been given a certificate to go to Palestine, and it was dated March 1935, and they arrived in Palestine that December.
So that's the certificate they came on.
Well, this was not the certificate itself. It was a note saying that Israel Shima received the certificate. And of course, that certificate is hugely important historically. Without that certificate, I would not be who I am, and probably would not be at all, because they left. And so in that sense, it was this uncanny moment of looking through an archive, doing a very clear historical, detached work, and your grandfather falls into your lap.
I want to actually, there's an interesting, just to build on what Omer was just saying, I think, a whole way of structuring a conversation about this subject, and there are obviously many ways, is about proximity and distance. One could call it geographically, culturally, temporally. So I always felt, so I want to make one point as an American Jew, which is that all Americans, with a very small exception, have a double identity, right? And so if you grow up in the 60s, 70s, as I did as a suburban second generation American Jew, there is always the double identity, the knowledge, even I was interested in these things, but even if one wasn't, that there was the old country where your grandparents come from, immigrants, your great aunts and uncles, cousins, whatever, and that if you had any kind of education, you knew that probably they had disappeared in the war if they hadn't made it over. And I'm very interested in the phenomenon of this sort of haunting, a very peripheral sense that somewhere out there are people that you have a tenuous connection. So here again, I'm sort of opposite to Omer in some sense, with a very intimate connection. But I always felt that the distance between my generation, my nationality, and the event that we're talking about created a kind of fascination. My mother, whose uncle and aunt and cousins I wrote my book about, didn't want to know about it. That was too close to her generation. The children, people who would have been children in the Holocaust. She didn't want to know about it. It was too painful. Her father went crazy from it, blah, blah, blah. So for me to write my book, necessarily, I think there was a kind of angle to the event. And I'm very interested in that. I mean, it's interesting to hear, the three of us talk about how we sort of backed into this subject, but it's fascinating to me the way you cannot get away from this question of relationality. Where do you stand in relation to the event and how that creates the interest that makes you embark on these journeys?
This is wonderful because it takes us to so many points that I was hoping to touch on. So I just wanted to go back to what all of you again touched on, which is if you could comment a little bit more on the serendipity. Daniel, you write a lot about conversations that, phone calls from Australia, encounters that wouldn't have happened if you came 5 minutes earlier. And I don't know if Atina, you already encountered those, but I wonder if you could comment how you see it also in a broader picture of things. Is this because you're more and more close to the subject that proximity creates those accidents? What do you make of it?
I mean, we've all Omer and Atina have just told amazing stories of these sort of fortuitous, and as I describe in my book, the most amazing coincidences kept happening. I mean, if it were a novel, you couldn't publish it because they would say this is crazy. I literally would get into an elevator in a hotel going down to the dining room, and a person standing next to me would say to me, I was in Babi Yar. And I would like, how did they know I'm doing a Holocaust book? It was just, and so again, I'm not a historian, but this kind of thing makes you wonder in a way that is very apropos why things happen the way that they do, which is a historian's question. So I kept being confronted by this story Omer just told about the thing falling into his lap. So many things like that happen. So people said, oh, it's a bashert, it's a blah, blah, blah. I don't know about that, but I do know that if you stay in your apartment and you don't leave, nothing's going to happen, right? But all kidding aside, it did make me start to think about why things happen. In the case of the story that I ended up uncovering, I always think that here was, after everyone else had been killed, here was my uncle and his daughter hiding in this fruit cellar in the Ukrainian Polish school teacher's house. And apparently they were there for some time. And then one day the neighbor, who had always been the neighbor, suddenly thought, why is this boy coming every few days and giving a package to this house? And I'm fascinated by that. Like, why on that day did the neighbors suddenly think something is funny going on in that house and not another day? And if it happened a week later, maybe they would have made it, you know? So this, look, the flip side, history is people making plans. And then the other half is accidents, right? And that's, so I don't think it's an idle question, you know, to think about these amazing things, because that's how things happen.
Yeah, you know, I'd say two things on this. One is sort of generational and one is very personal. And the generational is that my generation growing up in Israel in the 50s and 60s, we were the first generation. We didn't look back. We were taught we only looked to the future. So we were surrounded by all those people who came from the old country, but we did not listen to them. We felt embarrassed by them. We heard Yiddish and Polish and we would not know it quite consciously. And it took until usually our early 40s when members of my generation started doing what I did. That is asking their parents, where did you come from? Asking themselves, where is my family from? I did not come from nothing. I was not made from the dunes of the Mediterranean or from the foam of the waves. So this was a sort of generational opportunity. Now, once you took that, which I did with this Buczacz long story, then things happen. Once you open up to that, then opportunities happen and stories just come. And if you do what I did, and I think what Daniel did, that is, if you do it for a long time, then people also know that you're doing that. And stories just keep coming. And because we are talking about a period that is so crazy, that is so impossible, that things happen that you would never believe would happen. People come and tell you these stories, and they're their stories, they're individual stories, and each of them is unbelievable in its own particular way. Of children who survived, of people who discovered who they were only in the 20s or 30s, over and over. So, but it takes touching that point. It takes saying, I want to look back and here I am, I'm asking these questions, and so much of it then starts coming your way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking along both of Omer and Daniel's lines that the sort of truly, in Daniel's book, you know, rather amazing series of sort of, you know, serendipitous moments and circling back and, you know, connections that, you know, rationally one would not expect. I mean, in fact, do mirror the stories of survival or even of non-survival, but for as long as people were alive, that we read about and hear about all the time. You know, I mean, the people who were somehow by the luck of the moment who managed to escape, those who didn't manage to escape, those people in this, you know, even your relatives, Daniel, in the Soviet Union, who, you know, got off a train somewhere and then found each other again in Tashkent or didn't and reconnected. All seemingly impossible and much more, if you will, sort of miraculous even than what you experienced. So it's almost like a kind of a mirror or a lesser on a less dramatic scale, an enactment of what people actually went through. And then on this question of generation and place, I think that that's extremely important in thinking about, you know, when we come to write in a more personal vein. Certainly there are many historians who have, you know, who start out, Omer obviously is one, but there are many others who start out writing what, you know, we might call, you know, straight, as it were, you know, some more general histories, and then turn to the personal. And there are different ways to do that. One way is to sort of still segregate the two genres, right? And to people who will write history and then they will write memoir. And it's pretty clear which is which.
Or fiction, yeah.
Yes, and then there are people, I think, like Omer, and I think to some degree what I've tried to do in what I have published and what I'm trying to do now, who trying to do something more hybrid, if you will, which is to acknowledge the power of the personal, but in a sense to use it as an access to telling larger stories. And one can do that in different ways. One can use it as a push to go to do those travels and to then keep finding those circles and circles of connections that Omer referred to. Or one can, sort of in my case, where I'm suffering from a surfeit of material. I mean, I don't even have to leave my house to have a certain enormous archive that sort of resides in my file cabinets and unfortunately also still in boxes in the basement of letters. But to use those familial papers as a source, among others, to which I never would have had access, obviously, if they weren't my own, which I think that if somebody else who wasn't me found them in an archive, which is not impossible if it had been, somebody else rather than a historian who happened to find them, would still think, had some historical value. So I think it's also partially this generational moment for many of us where those family histories started to take on a different kind of meaning. I mean, I just, to sort of end this thought, I'm thinking about my ninth high school class, which is Hunter College High School in New York City, class of 1968. And it wasn't until I think our 45th reunion that we started to understand that every single one of us, and we were all girls, every single one of us had a family story that had to do with the war and or the Holocaust. Every one of us was the daughter of a survivor, a refugee, a war veteran, and in some cases of refugees who had come then from the former Soviet bloc, or in some cases even Iran somewhat later. But we didn't, when we were in school in 1968, the world was a very exciting place. And we wanted to be part of that world. School was an escape for us. Right. From that haunting, which we really wanted nothing to do with. And it was only, so much later through these roundabout ways, I think that we started to think whether or not we decided to write just memoirs or history.
Again, it circles back to this issue of proximity and distance in a different way that I think can be connected to historiography in some way. And, I just yesterday read this astonishing statistic about, I think it's something like 2/3 of American high school students think the Holocaust is exaggerated or didn't take place. So, in our different ways, very different ways, we're nonetheless all drawn to this subject because of a kind of proximity, even if it's a proximity we didn't want to deal with, as in the case of Omer, right? And I want to somehow tie this to this fascinating point that you were making before about that these amazing coincidences in the research and blah, blah, are somehow a kind of echo of or mirror of the amazingness of the event. And it reminds me of this extraordinary statement a survivor said to me, who told me one of these stories of escape that was just hair-raising. And I, in my naivete, I said, oh, that's such an amazing story. And she looked at me very coldly. She said, if you didn't have an amazing story, you didn't survive.
Yeah. No.
And I never forgot that. I get chills just thinking of it. And I think there's some sense in which the event itself is so extraordinary that you cannot help, if you do move close to it, it can't help but becoming personal in some way. You can't maintain a distance. You think you can because you're a historian or a scholar or whatever, or you're a second generation American and it didn't really happen to you or whatever. But it's so radioactive that to be near it is to be sucked into it. And it makes me think of that high school student survey, because as time passes, people like us are going to go away and the thread will break. Anyone who had any connection that was affective in some way is going to be gone. And at that point is the worry point, right? Because then how do you recreate or reconstitute some sense of proximity when actual or familial or emotional or historical proximity is no longer possible?
So you know, I mean, it's so, I mean, this raises so many points, just a couple. When I started studying the Holocaust, most of the scholarship on the Holocaust was about such questions as how was the decision on the final solution made? How were the trains made to run as they ran? How was the whole thing organized? These were questions that were coming from German historians. And they were interested in these questions because they wanted to know how their country organized these continent-wide genocide. And personally, they were interested in how their parents, uncles, grandparents had actually done that. But there were no individual voices in it.
Right.
And so one of my first sort of, the first impetus, I would say, to look at it differently was because I was exposed to that kind of scholarship that made me think they never wanted to touch the final product of that undertaking, which was killing people. Right. Once I started doing this project, and I think I read about 250 or listened and read about 250 testimonies. Some, you know, are like 3 hours long or many volumes of pages. Then of course what happens is what you say. Each of these stories on its own is entirely unbelievable.
Right.
The people who tell them, obviously, if it's not diaries, are people who survived. So the stories of the survival are things that you could not imagine. Each of them could be a novel.
Right.
I just published 3 diaries that are along these lines. It's absolute, and so it's very intimate, it's very personal, but it's also the general experience of the people who survived. There were no people who survived without a complicated story and an unbelievable story of survival. But the last point I wanted to make is about timing. So when I began this, which was about a quarter of a century ago, this was already starting to be the last moment. And recently I've been writing the actual big chapter of my conversation with my mother, which is well over 100 pages. And I'm listening to it and I'm looking at the transcript and I'm looking at all the photos. And I don't know who these people are. And there's no one to identify them anymore. And you have this moment, as historians, we know history moves back and that's fine. It gives us some, you know, also measure of time and balance. But these kind of documents that remained are no longer accessible to us in the same way. We have no one to tell us, this was Uncle so-and-so. That's right. Gone. You see a family resemblance, you can guess a little bit, but it's gone.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of jump in on 2 things. First of all, on, you know, Daniel's reminder about this, you know, survey, which it feels like we get these surveys at regular intervals. But that I think part of my, if you will, political motivation or interest in this particular project, which is about, you know, which is about German Jewish refugees in the East, and particularly in parts of the world that we today sort of have associated as sites perhaps of terror or threat to Jews today, served as sites of refuge and shelter from a barbarism that actually emanated from Europe, and that that I deal predominantly in my teaching with students who have not only no knowledge, but absolutely no genealogical connection to what they think of as the European Holocaust, right? And they are not deniers, they are not anti-Semites, but this is not a privileged story of horror and atrocity. They all come with their own family histories of displacement and war and mass death, or many of them do. And so for me to kind of engage in this sort of, what I think of as a kind of remapping of Holocaust experience to incorporate non-Western parts of the world is also a way, I hope, to tell a story that they can think about in ways that make it seem more resonant to them. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that I think that sort of the problem or the challenge or the danger for me is that I find myself, in a sense, replicating in a certain way the experience of my parents in terms of distance from the heart of darkness. And a large part of looking at the correspondence that I have looked at and that I look at is about precisely negotiating, navigating, misunderstanding, very often really misunderstanding to an embarrassing degree when I read it, the distance between where they are in an exotic, exciting, at times more or less precarious, for my father, who ended up as a enemy alien in a British internment camp in colonial India, extremely uncomfortable and miserable place, but also a place where, even in an internment camp, and certainly in Tehran, they were also privileged and quite safe as Europeans, and they are reading and responding to the letters that they are receiving from the family they left behind, which in my case are two grandmothers and one maternal grandfather who remain in Berlin, all of whom that's not supposed to happen, all of whom remain, are able to write until 1942. And the responses of my parents and also of friends and relatives elsewhere indicate how caught up they are in their own adventure, and it is an adventure, and their inability to understand what it is that their own parents and their own siblings are going through. And that distance is never resolved, because the people who are writing the letters and who are, and I have both sides of the correspondence, because there was clearly a sense that these letters might never arrive, or even if they arrived, they would be lost. They're all on carbon paper. There is no closure there. There was never, the ability to say, oh, now I understand what you were trying to tell me. Now I understand why, when this was my uncle actually writing to his mother in Berlin in 1941 saying, could you please, send me certain medical textbooks that I've forgotten, right? so that remains a painful, and in some ways I realize, guilt-laden disconnect. And I'm trying to write about the ways in which they tried to understand at the time their own relationship to their positionality. On the one hand, as Europeans in these colonial or semi-colonial spaces, and on the other hand, as those who had escaped and were writing very directly to those who had been left behind. So there's still a kind of, in German, there's that wonderful word, I don't know what, Berührungsangst maybe, that they had, sort of this anxiety of connection that I'm experiencing and hopefully sort of at least using as grist.
So much to continue. I want to touch on something that again all of you in a way responded to. So this proximity and distance seems to emerge as the key, and I wonder on a very practical sense. Not just with documents, Schmiel's letters in a second wallet, in the boxes in Atina's basement, but also being part of, being in some ways from there, even though not really, but in some ways by this familial connection. In what ways, how did it play a role in your, especially in collecting oral testimonies, in collecting stories? I think, Daniel, you don't use testimony as a term for it, but rather stories of this person, stories of that person. Was there some element of intimacy, even without your full understanding of what were the details of the story as you went along?
Well, I mean, I think it's inevitable. I mean, this is very much, what we've been circling around. I mean, it's funny because this book that I just published last week, 3 Rings, starts with an account of this sort of delayed reaction kind of breakdown I had after I finished making all my research trips and came back to New York. You can't, see, I was always interested in stories. I'm interested in narrative as a critic, as a writer. So that's what I'm attracted to. Some people said, well, why didn't he start in an archive? And my answer is because I'm interested in stories. That's what I was raised on. That's what I'm interested in. And this, in a certain way, I think brings us back to the problem of the whatever percentage of high school students don't believe that it's real. That when you're sitting across a table from someone and they are telling you these things that happened to them, you can't not be intimate with them. Unlike Atina and Omer, I walked into this bumbling, I knew about the Holocaust, what most people know about the Holocaust, but not in any specialized or scholarly way. But there's something magnetic about a narrative, about a story. I don't want to call it testimony because that's stylized and distancing. Everybody wants to hear a story. A bedtime story, a scary story. And so I think narrative is inevitably intimacy creating. And that's why I wanted to reconstitute in my book the conversations that I had, because once the people are gone, and now all of my survivors have died since I wrote the book, it's like a platonic.
Shlomo Adler, I think Shlomo Adler is.
I beg your pardon, Shlomo, God bless him, is still alive, right? But it's like a platonic dialogue, if I can invoke my actual expertise, right? Plato's trying to think of a way to make people do philosophy, and by forcing you to read dialogues instead of treatises, you have to reenact the back and forth, and it's automatically more intimate and engaging. So I feel that a great tool in providing the kind of education, hopefully, that will avoid these kinds of grotesque statistics that we've been reading about, is not to, is to somehow find a vehicle for creating or recreating the intimacy, of the narrative. A good historian can do that, right? Good writing does that, whatever the writing is, or however you constituted, watching the interviews, whatever. But I think, to me, narrative is intimate.
Yeah, so, I think, there are again a number of really interesting issues here. I just wanted to say, sort of in reference to what Atina was saying, that also because we're all writing all the time on this, so I was writing something, and that had to do, part of this chapter had to do with how people, this is my own family, how they are responding in Palestine to what is happening in the Holocaust. Okay. And they're living very tough lives. They're working very hard. They've actually gone down in social class and have become blue-collar workers. They're working 12 hours a day. My mother is raising her two smaller brothers because the parents are never there. And yet they know that something is going on there. And that sense that my mother talks about my grandmother as feeling, already when she got married, she was all alone, because when you got married, you had to live with your husband's family, and the other family lived about 60 miles away, so they would see them only in the summer, once a year, and that was it. But then when they moved to Palestine, they left the entire family, all this, extended family behind in Galicia. They came in 35, in 39, the war begins, and that's the end of it. They will never see them again. And so there is also this isolation. There is never Schadenfreude. I kept asking about that. I mean, saying we did the right thing. They never talk about that at all, but they just lose them all. And so this is something that there is guilt, I think. There is a sort of underlying guilt. These are not well-educated people, so they are speaking in very simple terms, but I think it's very important. Now, for me, this moment of intimacy, I have to say, was the first time I went to Buczacz, to that town. And it was, as so much of that was, it was uncanny, it was strange. The place looked the same, it didn't look at all the same. And I had a moment when I was driving from Potok, from a town that near Buczacz, where my mother actually spent the very early part of her childhood, along a sort of dirt road, crossing a stream, the Potok, the golden stream, to Buczacz. And I thought to myself, this was the road that my maternal grandfather used to go on, because he was an estate manager in Potok and he would go to Buczacz. And there was this sense that, a very strange moment, that of course it's all in the imagination, but it's as if a memory that you never had, that there were generations of my family who were there, and it's a beautiful landscape, and it's very quiet, it's very peaceful. It was a beautiful time of the year, it was June, and you feel the silence that is also enveloping everything that happened subsequently, and all the corpses that are buried there in mass graves. So everything was sort of coming together, and I couldn't articulate it. I still actually can't entirely articulate that, but it was this moment that I think for me was maybe, the core of the whole undertaking. But I also just want to touch on something that Daniel was saying, and I think it's very important, this question of tales, of telling stories, because I've been grappling with it too. And I think that so much, it's not only to reach the public, say people who don't know, it's the story itself, the history itself is a history of tales. So much, when you look at these places, the way people thought about themselves and thought about others, they told stories. And these stories were what became them, what became their entire making. They made history through telling tales. And obviously different groups told different tales, and there was some overlap in the tales between one group and another. But the tale, in that sense, it was sort of Urgeschichte. It was the sort of basis of history, telling stories. And that continues today. To this date, people are still telling stories. And so, yes, I feel that this is something not only of education, which it is, but also of actually making the past.
Well, I would also, I just want to jump in because you'll know much more about this, Omer, than I do, and Atina as well. But it seems to me there's a very serious intellectual and historiographical issue that comes out of this, which is people, especially people who are experiencing severe trauma. There's a very interesting issue in how people narrativize their own experience. So I, as a writer, not as a Holocaust expert, was interested in how my survivors created narratives out of these events. And it was interesting to sort of differentiate between people who had very rarely spoken about it, where you could feel the jagged edges and how it didn't all add up, and those who had given lots of interviews and been interviewed by Spielberg and talked to the local newspaper, and it was a smooth, well-shaped narrative. And this is way beyond my expertise, but I would think that that's another element of narrative that becomes very interested in the study of this event, because since so much of it is orally related, there's a psychological / narratological element that's very important, it seems to me.
So can I just say one word on this, because it's so, Dana and I once talked about this maybe 10 years ago or more, I don't know, in LA once. So for me, I mean, when I was writing, because when I was talking about tales, I'm talking also about old tales, 16th century tales, 17th century tales, 19th century historical novels that then retell these tales, and then these are the tales that people believe are the past. And so it's a long thing. It's not only trauma, although it's often about violence. When you talk about these kind of survival stories, for me, when I was doing that book, Anatomy of a Genocide, I was actually trying to do a number of things. One was to see, as you know very well, as Claude Lanzmann was sort of saying, you know, you want to see the story when it's told as if it just happened. And it could have been told after it just happened or a year later. It could be told 50 years later. But you can tell that the person telling the story is experienced as if it just happened. There's a moment of crisis in the telling. But I was trying as an historian also to juxtapose that with the historical documentation. So I was trying to also integrate that into the picture so that it won't be only the stories of the Holocaust, because that's part of what Atina is talking about. That then you have the survivors tell stories about the Holocaust. It doesn't matter if it happened or not, they have memory, but it's also an historical event. And Lanzmann was very much insistent on that. So it was also this mix of the two in order to create a fabric of history that has the voices of the people who were subjected to it, and also a kind of a network, historical network, documented network, that you know these stories happen in a real time, in a real place, and were perpetrated by real people.
Yeah, I mean, I think this encounter with the archival materials that reflect and really substantiate the stories, and sometimes in remarkably sort of direct way, is, you know, that is part of the adventure of being the historian, and it's part of the, you know, sort of the pleasure of going from the house to the archive, so that, I mean, you know, in my own work, which, you know, a lot of which actually, once I emerged from the YIVO archives into the, you know, sort of India office of the British Library, which I think is one of the great treasures of the world. I mean, it was sort of amazing to me to read these endlessly detailed and terribly, you know, arrogant and, you know, sort of reports of the British political residents in Iran, and find out that pretty much these tales, these sort of romantic, exotic, Oriental tales that for example, my father had told about his treks across the desert, that they actually had been observed and duly noted in records that were still sitting in the British Library. Just like I could find, not my mother, who had this extreme tendency to somehow drop under the radar, but certainly my father, that who I could find in my mother's case, her boss. My father, I was also able to find in the records of the German Foreign Ministry and the German political mission in Iran until 1941. So there are all these places that we can actually then track people in all the tragic ways that people can, through the ITS and through, Yad Vashem and through, all the sources that we know, and many, many others. And sort of, again, that's another one of those points at which the historian's, sort of disciplinary tendency, which is to go into the archive, rather surprisingly tracks onto the stories with which we grew up, but which we didn't necessarily connect as being historical with a capital H. I mean, I thought of my family stories as being the eccentricities of people who had a very unusual experience. And now I'm trying to turn it around and see it in a geopolitical sense as being actually very, very central.
We have questions, and I want to make sure we have a few minutes at least for them, but let me just drop one more connected to a lot of what you were saying, which is, I loved in Daniel, in your book, you write about those Chinese boxes as a way in which stories, your grandfathers and other stories are constructed. And I wonder, connecting it to the places becoming real in ways that to some extent echo the stories and to some extent change the stories or devalidate the stories or add a whole new layer to the stories, which is the other people living in those stories, in those towns. And for Omer's book, this is the incredible richness of the historical narrative, which has the Jewish narrative, the Polish, the Ukrainian, and the German experience of Buczacz. But I wonder if you could all comment on this as well, how this Jewish family history is also ultimately history of other inhabitants of Bolechów, Baghdad, etc.
Well, I think that again, it's such an interesting question, but I think that again goes to the issue of positioning, let's call it, so there is an obvious way in which, even say if one wanted to focus on a Jewish story in these places during the Holocaust, it inevitably is about other kinds of people. Some are collaborating, some are looking the other way, some are rescuing, whatever. But I think, again, it's about positioning. So my grandfather immigrated to America as a young adult, long before the war. His stories about Bolechów are happy stories. He was a small town kid from a charming, quite pretty little market town with forests and streams and trout and whatever. So I'm saying that because Shlomo Adler's stories about Bolechów are also stories about, my grandfather talked about Ukrainians and Poles and what a happy mix it was and blah, 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 some exceptions. So I think, again, this issue of positioning, both in space and time. And so that's for the people who actually lived the experience. So Shlomo has a different Bolechów, can talk about a different Bolechów from my grandfather. Then I come along 6 years later and I go to Bolechów or Bolechiv, And I'm thinking, could this possibly, this depressing little place, could this be the enchanted garden that my grandfather reminisced about? So I think it's so interesting because it all depends where you are. There is no baseline tale that will explain everything. Everything depends on position, I would say, both in space and in time. And I mention this because the degree to which the others come into the story, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and ultimately the Germans, who are also sharing in this story, depends where you are in relation to it, it seems to me.
So, Agnon tells the sort of chronicler, the great chronicler of Buczacz as a sort of the small East European Jewish town, tells the story of a Jewish town. And if you only read Agnon, you wouldn't know that there were maybe a few, a noblewoman here, a nobleman there, but it was a Jewish town. And I remember very often I would talk about Buczacz to an audience, there would be many Jews there, and they would say, my father came from Tarnopol or came from Bolechov or wherever, but it doesn't exist anymore. And I would say, what do you mean it doesn't exist? I was there last year, of course it's there. But there are no Jews there, so it doesn't exist anymore. Now, of course, the Poles told stories about their Buczacz, the Ukrainians told stories about their Buczacz, and for each group, in that sense, the town was a different town. They lived side by side, they interacted with each other, but they told very different stories. So this is sort of a part of it. But, when I was growing up, my sister and I would get into my maternal grandfather's large, to us it seemed enormous, bed, and he would tell us stories. And it was only years later that I realized that the kind of legends that he was telling us were Ukrainian legends. Right. They were not Jewish stories. He was a pretty Orthodox guy, but he worked with Ukrainians. He lived all his life there. His father was an estate manager. And the stories that he told were all about kings and dwarfs and wolves and bears. This was the stories that I heard. So although they remember the shtetl, they were also very much part of that scene. And that's to my mind, that's really important to remember, that this was both very separate and both very much together. Now, when we go there now, of course, as we heard, you come there and you think about this little town and you have to imagine what it looked like. But if you look at, say, a Polish tourist guide or a Polish travel account from the 1890s, and this Polish traveler says, you drive through this beautiful landscape and you see this beautiful town there, and you see all of Polish history is encapsulated in that town. And then you come there and it's full, it's full of dirty Jews. And so the town that traveler imagines is a beautiful Polish town from the beginning of Polish history, now in 1890 is polluted by the majority Jewish population there. So these are the different angles that you get on the same place, and each group has its own nostalgia and its own stories to go back and to fall back on.
And its own trauma. I remember getting a very angry letter after my book came out from a Ukrainian who said, no one is writing about the famine. No one is writing memoirs and endless studies of the Ukrainian famine that killed 7 million innocent Ukrainians. Right. And so, and I remember talking to a Ukrainian who had been during the war in my town and said, we know, of course, what happened to your people, but after the war was ended, that was the beginning of our troubles, when people were being sent to Siberia because they had a handbag or a bourgeois possession. So, again, it's about perspective, maybe.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, the one other point that this raises for me is that it's not only the sort of opening up to the multicultural context that Omer describes so beautifully, yes, and also so horrifyingly at times in Anatomy of a Genocide. But I think that certainly what this research has done for me is that it's also opened up for me a whole multicultural, transnational sense of Jewish history. Mm-hmm. Namely, that by crossing out of Europe and crossing out of the sort of Ashkenazi Jewish world, which had already been divided rather incorrectly into Western and Eastern European Jewry, which I also started to understand my own family differently in that connection, since my paternal family is from Mislovich, which is not so far from in Upper Silesia. But is that I found myself entering into a world of scholarship that I never would have been connected to if I hadn't followed these very German Jews into their Orient, namely the story of Mizrahi Jews, and in my case, particularly in Iran and in India, and then the ways in which they then interact with succeeding waves of Jews from other parts of Asia coming in, whether it's Baghdadi Jews coming into Iran, or whether it's European Jews coming into colonial India. And so I found myself, reading books like by Sarah Stein and by all these amazing historians of Jewry in the non-European parts of the world. And also, I was just at a extraordinarily fascinating conference held by the JDC on Jews, was focused on the JDC, but Jews in North Africa and Asia. And again, if I hadn't sort of followed that trail, initially I never would have ended up in Uzbekistan if I hadn't followed the trail of post-war German history to the Soviet Union, the prequel. And then if I hadn't sort of made that connection, I wouldn't, have expanded, on the one hand, this idea of sort of opening up and making much more global the history of the Holocaust, but also finding the links between different parts of Jewish history that I don't think I ever would have, begun to approach. Of course, I'll never know the languages. I'll never know, the sort of depths of regional and local histories that I would need, but at least I know where to look, and I know with whom who my interlocutors are. So in that sense, it's extremely enriching also in terms of our understanding of general history, but also really of Jewish history.
This is a wonderful and upbeat way to open those minute and a half that we have left to some of very interesting questions. So some of them are practical questions. What advice do the panelists have for someone embarking on family historical project of this sort?
Do it.
Okay, I fully agree. It sounds like your descriptions of happy accidents or coincidences that have impacted your work tremendously are without any spiritual component at all. Do you ever feel that there is a spiritual part of your work? Not a practical question.
I don't, because I'm not a spiritual person. So I don't believe in bescherts. I don't believe anyone is pulling any strings. I'm interested in the phenomenon of accidents and coincidences, but for quite other reasons, I would say.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word spiritual. The term that I've thought of was intimate, and I think as Daniel was saying earlier, I mean, my mother, who came in the mid-1930s, had very fond memories of her childhood growing up in Buczacz. She obviously didn't know what would happen, and it happened only very few years later. And this sense of joy in a place, this sense of the beauty of it, the small little memories of a child, that I think is very important. This because of the material we deal with, tends to either take you to the spiritual to the metaphysical, which is not a place that I go to as an historian, or to the horror and to complete cynicism, which is also not a good place as an historian or as any person to go to. But intimacy is something else. And that existed throughout the period. And for me, I must say that when I was writing the chapter about the actual daily experience of genocide, I had to make choices. And the choice I made was that I did want to choose stories in which there was goodness, that people made a choice to do something good. You can call it spiritual, you can call it something that it tells you something about the potential of every human being. That people made choices, and sometimes these choices were good. Sometimes they made them without even thinking, and most of the time they were doing really bad things, but that one choice saved people, and those people were left over to tell that story. And so for me, this was something not spiritual, but told me something I did want to know about humanity in this sort of heart of darkness.
It's also interesting to see whether the people were studying, whether they understood what was happening to them in those terms or in other terms.
And the last question I think we can take on, how do you make sense of partial oral histories steeped in family politics?
Well, I mean, certainly in my case, my grandfather used to say, everyone has a family and all families are crazy. So I think that, and this is really a historian's question, you have to get good at sifting through and filtering because, look, not just family histories, everyone who tells a story has an agenda. Not necessarily an evil, malicious agenda, but there's always an agenda. And if you're going to be the historian, you have to exercise to the best of your ability, some faculty that tries to account for motives in the contents of a story, the way it's told, what's being left out, what's being included. So I do think, I don't think there's an absolute rule, but you have to be aware that all family stories, have agendas.
I'll say one thing very quickly, that there was a question, why did my maternal grandfather decide to go to Palestine in 1935? My father had a very clear story. He was a Zionist. He was a member of the General Zionists, and he was a Zionist, and that's why he got the certificate. And I tried to ask my mother, why do you think your father? She knew her father better than my father knew him. Why do you think he would? She said, well, yes, he was a Zionist, but he had a very difficult relationship with his father. His father was very authoritarian. He wanted to be on his own. That's why he went. Right. So that was the politics of my family.
Right.
This is fantastically interesting, and I wish we had more time. Thank you for these 90 amazing minutes. And before I return the mic to Maugo, let me just say that we'll have a chance to continue this conversation on 11th of November, 2020, in a new Jewish year already. And we'll talk about family histories with Mary Jane Rochilson, who published Ellie's story, and Devin Nair, the author of Jewish Salonika Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece. But these are both stories that have a close, intimate family connection. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to Natalia, and thank you to our marvelous panelists. And I'm very happy that we are so unsatisfied with the fact that this conversation is so abruptly interrupted, because I hope that it means that in the new year, we are going to meet again, and we're going to have more and also inspiring conversations. Maybe, since this is our last program in the old year, and this is the last day of the old year, we would like to wish you all a peaceful and healthy and sweet enough, not too sweet, but just sweet enough new year, and many, many, many more fascinating and inspiring conversations at the Center for Jewish History. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Not so bad.